Well, good morning, brethren, and happy Sabbath to you all. It's good to be back up here again with you all again. I'm glad I was actually able to make it up this time, unlike the previous Sabbath. And welcome everyone who's also joining in to us via Zoom. Hope you're all having a very good Sabbath. Now today, my message, we're going to cover part 5 in the series that I've been going through here in Mumbai on the story of Moses and the Exodus. Now previously we've covered the story of Israel up to the end of the book of Exodus, the second book in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now today in part 5 we'll be covering the remainder of the Israelites' time at Mount Sinai, where they were actually based for 11 months. Now we'll mostly be looking at the tabernacle and the laws and statutes in the book of Leviticus and the early part of the book of Numbers. Now for those who are zooming in today, who wouldn't have seen any of the previous 4 messages in this series, those are all actually up on the UCG Fellowship site if you want to review those. Now Moses was one of the greatest leaders in the Bible who, with the help and power of God, led Israel out of Egypt. Now Cecil B. DeMille in his epic movie, The 10 Commandments, that movie goes for about 5 hours, and he took the story of the Exodus up to the golden calf incident and Moses getting angry and breaking the tablets, and that's where we're basically up to in this series. Now at that point, if you're watching that movie, it's gone for over 3.5 hours and we're all getting very sleepy. And so Cecil B. DeMille then suddenly jumps forward to very much to the end of the story with Moses at Mount Nebo watching the Israelites head across the Jordan. Now there's a whole lot more to the rest of the story of the Exodus that Cecil B. DeMille bypassed, and because it is bypassed, most of what happens after the golden calf incident is much less known than the more exciting events that we've covered so far in this series. Now today in part 5, and next time in part 6, we're going to cover some of those lesser known events of the back part of the Exodus journey, and I hope that they'll become a lot more clear and familiar to you by the time that I finish the series. Now to that end, I have also prepared a big handout with helpful charts, which I've emailed to Alan and a few others. So for those who are zooming in today, if you'd like a copy of those, just let us know and we'll see if we can get that out to you. Now if you do have a copy of it in front of you today, I'd like to draw your attention to the chart on pages 1 and 2 of the Moses handout that gives a concise harmony of the narrative part of the Exodus story. Now that will help you get a better familiarity with the timeline of the Exodus events. Now a more detailed chapter outline of Exodus through to Deuteronomy is covered at the back of that handout, which you can look at your own time. Now there are also other charts, diagrams, maps, and a 1-page summary of the laws and statutes in that particular Moses handout. Now the other handout that I've given you is a more detailed summary of the laws, statutes, and judgments which you can peruse in your own time. Now in part 4, we took the story up to the end of the book of Exodus. Now I only briefly stated what was covered in those chapters rather than discuss the tabernacle in more detail for the sake of time. Now the significance of the tabernacle and the items within it fits in well with the laws and instructions of the tabernacle and priesthood in the book of Leviticus that will be our main focus today. So let's look a bit more closely at the tabernacle. Now before the tabernacle was built, the interim predecessor of the tabernacle is mentioned in Exodus 33 verse 7, where it says, Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting. Now a couple of verses later it says, when Moses entered the tabernacle, that the pillar of cloud ascended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. Now the tabernacle, unlike the later temple, was instigated by God himself in Exodus 25 verse 8, where God says, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Now God wanted to dwell amongst them, just as any father wants to be with and spend time with his children. Now, of course, that relationship got strained a few chapters later when they made a golden calf to worship. But thanks to Moses' intercession, God continued to dwell amongst his people for the rest of the Exodus journey. Now, the court of the tabernacle, with its white linen curtain fence, was 100 cubits long and 50 cubits wide, which is about 45 metres by 22 metres, or 150 feet by 75 feet on the old scale. Or to put it another way, it was 2 cricket pitches long and 1 cricket pitch wide. Now, the photos on the right here are of a modern replica that you can visit today down near Timna, close to the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, in fact, I'll actually be visiting this place in a couple of months' time when I tour Israel for about a month with some friends. Now, in the courtyard was the bronze altar, which had bronze bull horns on each corner, and was where the burnt offerings were burnt and the peace offerings were cooked. Now, the bronze laver, which was used for washing, was close to that particular altar. Now, in the back half of the tabernacle courtyard, when entering from the east, was a tent that was divided into 2 compartments. Now, the tent of the tabernacle was 30 cubits long, and 10 cubits wide, and 10 cubits high. Now, that's just under 15 metres long and just short of 5 metres high and wide. Now, much of it was beautifully decorated with gold and other decorative elements, such as the veil that was coloured blue, purple and scarlet with golden cherubim. Now, the first compartment could only be entered into by the priests and was called the holy place. Now, the back third of that tent was 10 cubits high, 10 cubits wide and 10 cubits long, and it was called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And it was where the Ark of the Covenant was placed and could only be entered once a year on the Day of Atonement by the high priest. Now, in the holy place, there were 3 items. There was another altar that was used not for burning animals, but for burning incense. And it was called the altar of incense. Now, incense symbolises the prayers of the saints. Now, burning incense was what John the Baptist's father was doing at the time when an angel appeared to him and told him that he would have a son. Now, the next item in the holy place was the golden menorah, which symbolises Jesus as the light of the world. Now, the third item was the table of showbread, where 12 loaves of bread were placed, one for each tribe, symbolising God's provision for his people and Jesus as the bread of life. Now, inside the most holy place of the Holy of Holies was where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the 10 Commandments was placed. Now, inside it was also placed the rod of Aaron that budded miraculously and a pot of manna. Now, it was made of acacia wood and plated with pure gold. Now, it was about 114 centimetres long and 68 centimetres wide and 68 centimetres high. Now, it had a lid or cover with 2 golden cherubim with their outstretched wings touching each other. Now, it's often incorrectly referred to as the mercy seat. Now, it wasn't actually a seat. Now, the Hebrew word kipporoth actually means a cover. Now, it's very similar to the Hebrew word kippur, or as in Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And that word kippur basically means a cover. Now, in Genesis 2 verse 8 says, God planted a garden in the east, in a place named Eden. Now, in the story of the Garden of Eden, we can recognise 3 divisions within Eden. There was the land called Eden, and within that land of Eden, God placed a garden. And in the midst of that garden was where God planted 2 trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now initially Adam and Eve had access to both the garden and the midst of the garden where the two trees were. Now while they could eat one of them, all the other trees in the garden plus the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was forbidden. Now when they broke that command, they were cast out of the garden, but they were still within the land of Eden. Now after Cain's murder of Abel, we read in Genesis 4 verse 16, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east side of Eden." So we see these various degrees of separation from God because of different sins. Now the language that God uses here when talking with Cain in Genesis 4:7 is quite interesting as well. Now God says to him, if he didn't control his behaviour properly, then sin lies at the door. Now when the Israelites brought a sacrifice, they brought it to the door of the tabernacle on its east side. Now there were two cherubim that guarded the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Now they were represented by the two bronze pillars called Jachin and Boaz that were placed at the entrance of the holy place when Solomon's temple was built. Now Jachin means founding or foundation, and Boaz means strength. Now perhaps these were the names of those two cherubim who guarded the garden, the entrance to the garden. Now there were three divisions within the temple which replaced the tabernacle. You had the court of Israel, which was equivalent to the courtyard of the tabernacle. The next division was the holy place, or just the priests. And then you had the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, which was even more exclusive, being able to be entered only once a year by the high priest. Now these represented three different levels of access to God. Now sin is destructive to our relationships and our relationship with God in particular. The tabernacle and the temple represented the degrees of separation between man and God that were created initially with Adam and Eve's sin and expulsion from the garden. Now all the gates and the altars were east of the presence of God where the ark was. Now today, north is the most important cardinal direction, since that is the direction that a compass points to. However, in the ancient world, the most important cardinal point was east, where the sun rose up. Now the word orient, which we use today when we speak of sorting out our directions, means east. We also speak of the Orient as being the far east of Asia. Now we've already discussed two altars, the altar where the burnt offerings were burnt and the altar of incense in the holy place. Now there was also a third altar that is discussed in Leviticus 4:12, which speaks about the sin offering. It says there that the whole bull he shall carry outside the camp to a clean place where the ashes are poured out and burn it on wood with fire. Where the ashes are poured out, it shall be burnt. Now this sin offering altar outside the camp was where the sin offerings were burnt, was later referred to by the Jews as the Mifkad altar. Now the Apostle Paul, in speaking about the death of Jesus Christ, speaks about this altar in Hebrews 13, where he says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." Now Paul here strongly implies that Jesus was crucified not only outside the gate of the city of Jerusalem, but also outside the camp near the altar where the sin offerings were burnt, that Christ was the ultimate type of. Now Paul's comments here imply that Jesus was crucified east of Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, close to where the Jews burnt their sin offerings. Now Paul here says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat." Now the priest could not eat any part of these offerings. Now, in relation to the items in the tabernacle and the temple, Paul wrote in Hebrews 9:23 that they were copies of the things in the heavens. Now, in Revelation 11:19 it also says that the temple was opened in heaven and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. Now, just as you had degrees of separation from Adam and Eve's to Cain's sin, typifying mankind's sins, we find typified in Jesus Christ the reconciliation and breaking down of each of these degrees of separation. Now, firstly, Paul in Ephesians 2 speaks of how he broke down the middle wall of separation or partition between Israel and the Gentiles that barred the Gentiles from entering the temple. Now, physical Gentiles can become spiritual Israelites in the church, which is the spiritual temple that Christ is building. Now, next, in 1 Peter 2 verse 9, Paul speaks about the church being as a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And we know that only priests could enter the holy place. Now, finally, as symbolised by the torn curtain at the front of the Holy of Holies when Jesus died, Jesus has given us direct access to God the Father. In Hebrews 10 verses 19 and 20 we read, "Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiness by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh." Now, the book of Leviticus is the next book of Moses after the book of Exodus. Now, the Talmud refers to the book as the law of the priests. Now, our English title comes via the Greek translation known as the Septuagint, which called it a word meaning that which pertains to the Levites. Now, the preface in the book of Leviticus in the Thomas Nelson printing of the Bible says the following about Leviticus. Leviticus is God's guidebook for this newly redeemed people, showing them how to worship, serve and obey a holy God. Fellowship with God through sacrifice and obedience show the awesome holiness of the God of Israel. Then they quote a verse that sums up the whole book, Leviticus 19:2, which says, "You shall be holy, for the Lord your God is holy." Now, the Hebrew word for holy is kadesh, which also translates as sacred. Now, there are two aspects to this holiness. One is being called to be separate in the sense of being called separate for a godly purpose, as well as separating ourselves from the sinful ways of the world. Now, the other aspect flowing on from that is being pure and uncontaminated from sin. Now, the first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus have instructions for the 5 different types of sacrifices that we'll look at shortly. Now, most chapters of the book of Leviticus have instructions and laws, beginning first of all with laws for the priesthood and then broadening out to other laws for all the people of Israel. Now, if you notice in the chart with the harmony of the Exodus story on your handout, the only entry I have from Leviticus that's on that harmony is chapters 8 through to 10, where Aaron and his priests are consecrated as priests, and the death of 2 of his sons, for an act that was against God's instruction. So most of this book is laws and statutes, so not too much relating to the actual Exodus journey itself. Now, some other notable chapters and laws in the book include the laws of clean and unclean meats, which is in chapter 11, the Day of Atonement, 2-goat ceremony in chapter 16, the law against eating blood in chapter 17. Now, God there says that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Now, today we know that oxygen and nutrients for the body flow through the blood, so it's an accurate statement. Now, in chapter 18, we have laws against all sorts of improper sexual and marital relationships. Leviticus 19 verse 18 contains a law about loving your neighbour as yourself. So that's definitely not just in the New Testament. Now, Leviticus 23, amongst those of us in the Church of God, is our usual go-to chapter outlining each of the 7 festivals that he gave to Israel. Now, Leviticus 25 is where we find the law about the Sabbath year and also the Jubilee year. And Leviticus 26 is often referred to as the blessings and cursings chapter. So that's just a quick outline of some of the high points. Now, there are 5 types of offerings that were offered in the tabernacle that are described in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. Now, the first 3 were voluntary sacrifices: the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the peace offering. Now, the sin offering and the trespass offering were made in the case of certain sins were obligatory. Now, all apart from the grain offering involved the slaughter and sacrifice of an animal. Now, the Life Application Bible commentary on this says the following: animal sacrifice seems obsolete and repulsive to many people today, but animal sacrifices were practiced in many cultures of the Middle East. And God used the form of sacrifice to teach his people about faith. Now, sin needed to be taken seriously. When people saw the sacrificial animals being killed, they were sensitised to the importance of their sin and guilt. Our culture's casual attitude towards sin ignores the cost of sin and the need for repentance and restoration. The ceremonies and rituals were the best way for the Israelites to focus their lives on God. End of quote. Now, the first sacrifice mentioned, the burnt sacrifice, represented complete dedication and surrender to God. The animal would be an unblemished male and symbolically bear the sins in place of the one who offered the animal up for sacrifice. Now, after the blood was sprinkled on the altar, the animal was completely burnt up, and none of it was roasted for eating. Now, the grain offering, which accompanied all burnt offerings, was a gift of thanks to God. It reminded the people that their food came from God, and that they therefore owed their lives to him. The absence of yeast symbolises the absence of sin, and the oil symbolised God's presence. Now, part of the grain offering was burnt on the altar as a gift to God, and the rest of it was eaten by the priests. Now, these offerings helped support them in their work. Now, the third sacrifice, offering was the peace offering, which symbolised peace and fellowship with God through shed blood. Now, after some meat was ceremonially waved and given to the priests, worshippers and their guests could share in the feast as a meal with God. And obviously this was a pretty popular offering. Now, sin offerings and trespass or guilt offerings focused on paying for sin. The sin offerings atoned for sins against God. The trespass or guilt offerings addressed sins against others and included paying damages with interest. Now, in Leviticus 8 and 9, we read about the consecration of Aaron and his 4 sons. Now, here are a couple of photos showing what the high priest and the other priest's garments look like. Now, in addition to the long white robe, the high priest also wore an ephod over the top of the robe that was predominantly blue. Now, on the shoulder pieces were 2 onyx stones on which were engraved the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, attached to the ephod by chains of pure gold was a breastplate containing 12 precious stones in 4 rows. Now, tucked in behind the stones of the breastplate were the Urim and the Thummim, by which the priest could inquire directly from God. Now, according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, it says here that the view most commonly held today is that the Urim and Thummim were 2 sacred lots, one indicating an affirmative or favourable answer, the other a negative or unfavourable answer. Now, the chief support of this view is found not in the Masoretic text, but in the reconstruction by Wellhausen and Driver of 1 Samuel 14:41 on the basis of the Septuagint. If this fault be me, or in Jonathan my son, give Urim, and if it be thy people Israel, give Thummim. End of quote. Now at the end of the consecration, we read in Leviticus 9:23 and 24, and Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle meeting and came out and blessed the people. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Now Aaron and his family, who became the priesthood family, were only one family amongst the Levites. Now Levi had three sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Now each of these families were given duties to support the priesthood, the physical assistance needed in the running of the tabernacle, as well as supporting the work of teaching the nation about the laws, statutes, and judgments. Now their duties are mentioned in Numbers 3 and 4. And they also help carry the objects of the tabernacle when they are on the move during the Exodus. Now as shown in the two illustrations here, the Ark of the Covenant was to be cloaked by a beautiful blue covering when they were on the move. Now between the blue ephod of the high priest, the blue sapphire under God's feet when the 70 elders dined with him, and this covering for the ark, you get the impression that blue is a particularly favourite colour of God's. Now in Numbers 18, 20 and 21 we read, and the Lord spoke to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in the land, nor shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance amongst the children of Israel. Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance, in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting. So we see here that they weren't to be given any land inheritance. Now the Israelites were to give a tenth or tithe of their earnings in produce and any other earnings to the tribe of Levi to provide for their needs as they served the tabernacle and taught the Israelites God's laws. The Levites not getting a land inheritance seemed to be God's way of providing a check and balance, as if they had both the tithes and a land inheritance that could have led to an improper concentration of power. Now in Hebrews 7, Paul spoke about a change of the law of the tithe. Now our Church of God interpretation of what Paul wrote is that the change was about who in the New Testament era was to receive that tithe, and that Paul spoke of the church now receiving the tithe instead of the Levites. Now Numbers 35 tells us that the Levites were to be given 4 cities each in each of the 12 tribal inheritance, or 48 cities in total. Now in the midst of each tribe, they were to teach God's law to the people. Now I mentioned in part 2 that Aaron's wife, Elishama, was from the tribe of Judah. Now Aaron's wife, Elishama, was the daughter of Aminadab and a sister of Nashon. Now Aminadab and Nashon actually later appear in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in the Gospels. So we see that Moses' sister-in-law was from the line of Judah that Jesus would be born through. Now in Leviticus 10 we read what happened shortly after the consecration of the priests. It says here, that Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Now David Guzik in his commentary says the following about this event. He writes, in the afterglow of the consecration experience which Nadab and Abihu were part of, these two sons of Aaron sought to connect with God their own way, apart from the specific ceremonies God revealed to Moses, which he had not commanded them.
They came in an unauthorised way, coming to God, but demanding to come according to their own preference. Therefore, God considered this a profane fire before the Lord. Profane fire was a fire that was not kindled from the altar of burnt offerings. It was a fire not associated with the atoning and redeeming work of sacrifice. The fire on the altar of burnt offerings was sacred because it was kindled by God himself. Nadab and Abihu offered a fire of their own making before the Lord. Now this may have had the sense that they dared even go past the veil into the Holy of Holies, behind the veil to where the Ark of the Covenant was. Perhaps they thought they had accomplished too much during the time of consecration and were now worthy to go in and quote. Oh, actually there's more to us. In Leviticus 16, 1-2, the sin of Nadab and Abihu is mentioned again in connection with the high priest entering the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. Now this adds to the idea that one of the sins of Nadab and Abihu was going beyond the holy place into the Holy of Holies, which they were not permitted to do so. Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons, with you when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. This commandment for the priests of Israel came immediately after the judgment of Nadab and Abihu. Now this causes us to believe that they may have been drunk when they foolishly offered their profane fire before the Lord. That you may distinguish between the holy and unholy, between the unclean and the clean. This is the first of the two priestly responsibilities listed in verse 11. The priest had to discern and explain the difference between the holy and unholy, and between the unclean and the clean. He had to know it for himself and explain it to the people. End of quote. So we see here that Aaron lost 2 of his 4 sons because of this presumptuous act on his son's part. Now the next oldest son, Eleazar, would become the next high priest after Aaron and carry on the line of high priests. His other remaining son was called Ithamar. Now this brings us to our 7th lesson that we can learn from Moses and the Exodus. Worship and obey God in the manner that he tells us to, and not in our own way. Now in Deuteronomy 4 verse 2, God said, "You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." Now we see in the New Testament that Jesus chided the Pharisees, saying that they were worshipping in vain because they kept the added traditions of men instead of the commands of God. Now we are to worship and obey God on his terms and not on our terms, and not have a pick and choose approach to his law, obeying the ones that we like and disobeying the ones that we don't like. Now also in Deuteronomy 12 verses 30 and 31, God said to Israel, "Do not inquire after their gods, saying, 'How did these nations serve their gods? I will also do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God that way.'" So as we're well aware of, God forbids mixing the worship of pagan customs with the worship of him. Yet we find this quite often in mainstream Christianity with the holidays of Christmas and Easter, which are a blend of Christian ideas and pagan customs. Now most of mainstream Christianity rejects the feasts of the Lord, as they call it in Leviticus 23 verse 2, for Christmas and Easter, which are not found in the New Testament and were never kept until the 1st century AD. The Catholic Church, of its own authority and not from any New Testament command, also changed God's 7th-day Sabbath with Sunday keeping. Now Jesus, in John 4 verse 24, told us that we are to worship God in spirit and in truth, not with the false teachings or with our own human ideas or customs. Now Leviticus 11, and repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 14, God gave laws about which animals are clean and fit for eating, and which animals are unclean and not fit to be eaten. Now, quite a number of animals on the list of unclean foods, such as pigs, lobster, crabs and other seafood, are popular with people in our world today, even amongst mainstream Christians who see these laws as only for ancient Israel and not for Christians, claiming they were done away with the Old Covenant. Now, it should be noted that the distinction between clean and unclean animals has been around long before even Abraham and the nation of Israel. Now, God told Noah in Genesis 7 verse 2, "You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female." Now, as the creator of all creatures, God knows what animals he designed for human consumption and what animals he designed for other purposes, such as scavenging, eating of carrion, water filtration, consuming of waste products, and so on. Now, we should trust that God knows what is good for us and what isn't. Now, in our United Church of God booklet, what does the Bible teach about clean and unclean meats? It says the following. Now, God states that cud-chewing animals with split hooves can be eaten. Now, these specifically include the cattle, sheep, goats, deer, and gazelle families. And we also list such animals as camels, horses, rabbits, and pigs as being unclean or unfit to eat. He later lists such creeping things as moles, mice, and lizards as unfit to eat, as well as 4-footed animals with paws, such as cats, dogs, bears, lions, tigers, etc., as unclean. Now, he tells us that salt and freshwater fish with fins and scales may be eaten, but water creatures without those characteristics, catfish, lobsters, shrimp, crabs, clams, mussels, squid, frogs, octopi, etc., should not be eaten. He identifies carrion eaters and birds of prey as unclean, plus ostriches, storks, herons, and bats. Birds such as chickens, turkeys, and pheasants are not on the unclean list and therefore can be eaten. Now, insects, with the exception of locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers, are listed as unclean. So locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers can be eaten. Now, I find it quite amusing that giraffes, which chew the cud and have split hooves, are actually clean. And that would certainly feed a hole in our tribe. Now, that by extension would also mean that Noah was to take 7 pairs of giraffes with him onto the ark. Now, in the Bible story, Volume 2, produced by the Worldwide Church of God, it notes, "It is evident that certain animals have digestive systems which don't carry off as many poisons as do others. A pig digests its food in about 3.5 hours. A cow requires 24 hours to do the same thing through 2 digestive processes, screening out impurities that would otherwise pass into its flesh and its milk. The main reason any animal is unclean is that it wasn't meant to be eaten by man. Now, God made some animals for human food, others for work, for pets, for consuming waste products, and for controlling the numbers of creatures." End quote. Now, even with clean animals, not every part of them was designed to be eaten. In other statutes, God forbids the eating of blood and fat. And we also see that the liver and kidneys were also separated from the offerings and they were burnt off. Now, these organs were designed for the purpose of screening out impurities and toxins. Now, on the second handout that I've given you, it includes a list of all the laws, statutes, and judgments with brief comments on them. Now, among them are religious laws, family laws, property and judicial laws, health laws, and many others. So you've got that as homework if you'd like to in your own time to peruse. Now, another set of laws that most mainstream churches also treat as part of the Old Covenant and supposedly done away with are the 7 festivals that God gave to Israel in Leviticus 23. Now God makes it clear in verse 2 that these are not just feasts for the Jews, but he calls it the feasts of the Lord, and then says, these are my feasts. Is that better?
Yeah, speak a little louder.
Okay. Now in Zechariah 14 there is a millennial prophecy speaking of all nations keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. Now this begs the question, why would God insist on all nations keeping the feast if it was done away with or just for the Jews? Now in 1 Corinthians 5 verses 7 and 8, Christ is called our Passover, and the Apostle Paul directly tells the Gentiles at Corinth, therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. They're speaking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread that immediately follows Passover. Now with many things of God, they are often multi-layered like an onion, or they have a duality in meaning or fulfilment. Now the feasts of the Lord are just one of those things. Now they had one meaning for Israel, such as their rescue from Egypt and celebrating their physical harvest. And as Paul drew out in 1 Corinthians 5, there is also another Christian layer of understanding to these feasts shown here in this list. Now in Colossians 2 verse 17, Paul refers to the feasts as a shadow of things to come. Now in other words, some of them picture prophetic events in our future. Now the Christian symbolism of each of God's festivals are: 1, Passover, Christ's sacrifice to pass over our sins; 2, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, putting sin out of our lives and developing God's character; 3, Pentecost, the church is God's first fruits; 4, the Feast of Trumpets, the day of the Lord and Christ's return; 5, the Day of Atonement, the banishment of Satan; 6, the Feast of Tabernacles, which pictures the millennial spiritual harvest; and 7, the 8th day, which pictures the great white throne judgment. Now, a couple of related laws to the festivals were the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year, which are both found in Leviticus 25. Now, each 7 years, Israel was to let its fields rest and not sow them or prune their vineyards. Now, some food would still grow, which they could use for themselves and their animals. Now, the animals would also graze over the fallow fields. Now, their droppings and the rest from grazing would help the fields to regenerate for the next cycle, just as we need rest each day and also each week. Now, each 7th Sabbath year, there was to be a Jubilee. Now, if during the previous Jubilee a family sold off their family inheritance, they could recover their family inheritance at the next Jubilee. Now, this law helped with preventing the monopolisation of land by the rich, as well as other benefits. Now, family inheritance land could only be leased until the next Jubilee year, and not bought outright by the rich. Now, in Leviticus 26, Moses gave instructions that when they reached the promised land, that they were to go to Shechem, and half of the tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim and proclaim the blessings noted in that chapter if they would obey God, and half of the tribes were to stand on Mount Ebal and proclaim the curses for disobedience to God and renew their covenant there. Now, Joshua was told to build an altar on Mount Ebal, the mountain of the curses, on the north of Shechem, which makes sense as atonement was needed to be made for disobedience. Now, the other mountain, Mount Gerizim, the Blessings Mountain, is where the Samaritans later built their temple. Now, the next book of Moses after Leviticus is the book of Numbers. Now, it is given this name because of the census which begins the book. Now, just under 40 years later, at the end of the years of wandering, another census would be taken in Numbers 26. Now, the book of Numbers tells the story of the Exodus near the end of their time at Mount Sinai, through to the appointment of Moses and the preparations to cross the Jordan River. Now, just to give a quick overview, the narrative chapters go from chapter 9 through to chapter 27, when Joshua is anointed as Moses' successor. Now, chapter 1 starts with the first Exodus, then the arrangement of the camp, and then there are several chapters of laws and duties of the Levites. Now, following the second Passover in chapter 9, they finally leave Mount Sinai in chapter 10 after being there for 11 months. Now, we'll preview the rest of the chapters in the final part of lessons from Moses and the Exodus. Now, before we wrap things up today, let's look at a couple of things from those first few chapters before they depart Mount Sinai in chapter 10. Now, while they were still at Mount Sinai, just over a year after they have left Egypt, there was a census taken of all the males over 20 years. Now, the grand total, not including the Levites, was 603,550 men over the age of 20 who are able to go to war, which would rule out elderly males over a certain age. Now, Judah is the most numerous at 74,600. Now, not including the Levites, the half-tribe of Manasseh is the smallest at 32,200. Now, Benjamin, the smallest full tribe, is 35,400. Now, the Levites are numbered from 1 month and above, not from age 20, yet they number considerably less at 22,000. Now, in chapter 3, the number of firstborn males of all tribes from 1 month and above is given as 22,270. So 270 more than the total of Levites. Now, instead of taking the firstborn for the servicing of the tabernacle, God does an exchange and takes the tribe of Levi instead. Now, to redeem from God those extra firstborn, those 273 above the 22,000, he asks them to pay 5 shekels. Now, the number of firstborn males from all tribes is given as just over 22,000, yet we know there were 603,000 males who could go to war. Now, if you take the total number of males, that's 603,000, and divide that by the number of firstborn, you get a number close to about 30. Now, some critics have latched onto that to say that 603,000 males is too high because the average number of males per family could not have been close to 30. Now, the likely way that these numbers are reconciled is that the number of firstborn males are the number of new firstborn males born since they left Egypt over that past year. Now, in chapter 2, we read that the camp was arranged so that the Levites encircled the tabernacle, and then branching out from each cardinal point were 3 tribes each, counting Joseph as 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, the 4 lead tribes were Judah in the east, Ephraim in the west, Dan in the north, and Reuben in the south. Now, their tribal emblems respectively were a lion for Judah, an ox for Ephraim, an eagle for Dan, and a man for Reuben. Now, these 4 animals are also the same 4 animal faces that we see on the 4 living creatures described in the book of Revelation. Now, the northern and southern tribes had roughly similar numbers. However, the eastern tribes and the western tribes, there was a difference. The eastern tribes, including Judah, numbered the most. So if I happened to launch my drone over the camp of Israel and it was facing from the east, where Judah was, looking to the west where Mount Sinai was, as illustrated in the diagram on the right, it is likely that the camp of Israel would actually look like a cross. Now, when Balaam would later try and curse Israel, he was also looking from the east at Beth Peor to the camp of Israel with the promised land in the west. So he would have seen a similar formation. Now, as a keen fan of astronomy, I also find it quite interesting that here in the southern hemisphere, that two of our brightest stars, Alpha and Beta Centauri, known as the pointers, point directly to the Southern Cross in our southern sky. Now we read in chapter 9 that they kept the Passover, which was the first one that they kept after the death of the firstborn in Egypt. Now about 5 weeks later, late in the second month of the year, they finally left Mount Sinai. Now they arrived at Mount Sinai in the third month after leaving Egypt, and then in the next year in the second month, so they had been at Mount Sinai for 11 months in total. Now much of this time would have been required to build the tabernacle to God's high exacting standards. Now on that note, with the Israelites finally ready to depart Mount Sinai from the Promised Land, we'll conclude part 5. Now in part 6, we'll see that their eventual journey will get extended for another 40 years due to their disobedience and lack of faith. But eventually, a new generation will finally make it to the Promised Land, though Moses will only get to see it from afar on top of Mount Nebo. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to sharing the last part of Moses and the Exodus when I have the chance to speak to you next time. Thank you.